to welcome students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends to the Economic Department's third annual Commoner Lecture. We're honored and thrilled to have as our guest and speaker Raghuram Rajan, the Eric J. Gleacher Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Professor Rajan received a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology and an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management before earning his PhD in economics or maybe in finance from the Sloan School at MIT. His dissertation was titled Essays on Banking. Professor Rajan's research on banking, corporate finance, and economic development has been published in the most prestigious economic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Finance. He was twice honored with the Smith-Breeden Prize, awarded for the top papers not related to corporate finance in the Journal of Finance, and then for 3 consecutive years, he was awarded the Brattle Prize, awarded for the top corporate finance papers by the Journal of Finance. So he's been well rewarded through that journal. In 2003, Professor Rajan was awarded the inaugural Fisher-Black Prize, given every 2 years by the American Finance Association to the financial economist under the age of 40 who has made the most significant contribution to the theory and practice of finance. Professor Rajan ventured into the world of policy in 2003 when he became the chief economist for the International Monetary Fund, and into the world of popular press with 2 books, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists in 2004, and Fault Lines, How Hidden Cracks Still Threaten the World Economy in 2010. For the latter, he received the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award. Professor Rajan became an increasingly important figure in the global community as it sought explanations for the financial crisis of 2008. When economists and pundits rushed to lay blame, Professor Rajan was more nuanced and thoughtful. In Fault Lines, Professor Rajan went beyond simplistic discussion of what pushed the financial system over the edge to what brought it there in the first place. In his list of causes, he includes financial inequality, an insufficient social net, implicit government guarantees, regulatory uncertainty, politicians who expanded credit for political gain, and the rest of us for using that credit to buy houses we couldn't afford. In response to critics who, with the benefit of hindsight, categorized the crisis as an avoidable inevitability, Professor Rajan more soberly saw the crisis not as a foregone conclusion, but as a tail risk, a contingency that should have been planned and whose likelihood was exacerbated by innovation and risk-taking in the financial sector. Further, Professor Rajan did not need the benefit of hindsight for this diagnosis. He had warned of it for years, most notably in his paper, Has Financial Development Made the World Riskier?, which he presented to the world's policy elite at a conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2005. Here, with preternatural foresight, he described how financial innovations such as credit default swaps had compelled financiers to take on more risk, which, if the gambles were to turn out badly, would threaten the liquidity of the financial system as a whole. Few in the audience at that time took his warning seriously, and some were openly hostile. A predominant thought at the time was that expertise in monetary policy had our business cycles under control. Today, however, his ideas are received much differently, always with respect and often with reverence. Tonight, Professor Rajan will be speaking on whether capitalism and democracy have been captured by the elite. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, thanks very much for that very kind introduction. Please, I'm sure you won't treat any of my ideas with reverence, but with the amount of skepticism that is important in any academic setting. We're here to debate, and I'm not here to pontificate. So please feel free to ask questions. And we can do it at the end, we can do it in the middle. If you have, I have a certain amount of things I want to say, I want to get through, but I also want to hear what you will think about it and what questions you have. So let's treat this as not so much a lecture, but an interchange, okay? Why do I have this topic? Because I think that what we're seeing around us is a lot of anxiety about the world. We've seen this tremendous crisis, which is raising questions about the free enterprise system. Does it really work? Is it doomed to move from crisis to crisis? And we've seen a massive bailout, certainly of the banks, and of course the people protesting the Occupy Wall Street movement and its various cousins across the world are basically saying this is terribly unfair. One set of people took us into the crisis, they got bailed out. What about us? Why do we have to bear the pain? And in this kind of environment, we're also moving away from democracy. Who are the most powerful entities who are working on rescuing the system? It's the central bankers, the unelected central bankers, whether it's Mario Draghi in Europe putting the balance sheets of governments at risk by taking on huge amounts of risk onto the ECB's balance sheet, or whether it's Ben Bernanke through various forms of quantitative easing expanded the Fed's balance sheet to something like 20% of US GDP. So that the central bankers have a lot of power, but also a number of unelected governments now have power. Think about the technocratic governments in Greece, governments in Italy. In fact, they're trusted, at least temporarily, more than you trust the elected governments that preceded them. So that seems to suggest democracy is in crisis, even as the economies themselves are imploding. Youth unemployment in Spain is close to 50%. If you look at Greece, it's nearing that. In the United States, tremendous number of houses under foreclosure. So lots of people bearing tremendous amounts of pain, even while it seems that the 1% are spending like they've never spent before. BMW sales in the United States are at an all-time high. The 1% seem to be making out pretty well. So what's happened to equal opportunity and justice? Have the capitalists essentially captured policy? Is democracy dead? Are the labor unions powerless because they've been crushed by the power of the elite? Those are the kinds of questions which are being raised today, and I think it's worth trying to answer them. I'm going to argue that the answers are more complicated than the obvious ones you see. I don't think that necessarily democracy is dead. I think it is functioning, but it's not functioning necessarily in the way that we would like it to function, in a way that would provide longer-term solutions. Similarly, I don't think capitalism is dead. I think the market works reasonably well. It has its flaws. It's not flawless. It needs to be governed in a reasonable way. But I think in general, the market produces reasonable outcomes. The problem is we haven't learned to deal with both a moderately free market, but also free finance, as well as a political structure which, in a sense, has to respond to political pressures. Putting all three together, a finance-dominated market democracy, that's the beast that we haven't figured out how to deal with, and I think we still haven't. There are lots of problems going forward in how to deal with it. So that's where I'm going, but I want to start by saying, if you take this as a received wisdom, democracy broken down, politics captured by the elite, no difference between the two parties in the United States, they both owe their money to Wall Street, they're both doing what Wall Street wants them to do, is that a reasonable view of what's happened today? And I think the important sort of questions you want to ask about this kind of view is, does it fit with everything that we see? For example, why are economies in trouble? And I think the the answer differs from country to country. But if you look at Greece, for example, one of the reasons Greece is in trouble is not because it was following extremely pro-elite policies, but because Greece went out and spent like there was no tomorrow, certainly from the government side, over the last 7 to 10 years. How did it manage to spend that? Because it got into the euro area. Greek debt was treated like the debt of other countries. It was treated as solid debt. Greek governments went out and hired a lot of people into the government. Government expanded in terms of personnel by about 20% of the last 7 to 8 years. That size of government, though not necessarily huge by the standards of Europe, was unaffordable for Greece. Similarly, if you look at Spain, the federal government didn't spend too much, but the local governments went out and spent. There are airports which are fantastic in many local areas in Spain, but unaffordable because there are very few planes that actually land in those airports, and they've constructed those in an enormous fashion. Similarly, if you think about what precipitated the financial crisis, either in the United States or in Ireland, it wasn't pro-elite policies necessarily. I mean, think of the root of the problem in the United States. It was subprime mortgage lending. It was lending to the poor. Not quite the very poor, but lending to the lower middle class. That is typically what would be subprime. And in Ireland and Spain, again, the roots of the banking crisis in those countries is a massive expansion in housing. This is not about loans to big businesses which go bankrupt. This is not loans to big real estate developers necessarily. There's some of that. But it's also loans to a lot of people who can't afford the housing that they bought. So the first is the way countries have gotten into trouble doesn't sit well with the notion that it was pro-elite policies which got us into trouble, at least not directly. You may argue that this kind of lending helped the elite at some level. There are some arguments made like that. But certainly the lending that got the United States into trouble was not to the rich who then defaulted. It was to the poor who then couldn't afford it. Second note that doesn't sit well is why, if you argue that democracy is dying, it's been crushed by, and that's why we've got these pro-elite policies, it seems to sit oddly with what we see happening not just in this country but around the world. If you think of the Arab Spring, it seems that people have gotten a better ability to organize, whether through Twitter, Facebook, or mobile phones. The capability to organize has improved. That would make democracy work better rather than work less well. If you recollect, in Egypt, there's a lot of organization done by the means of new media. If you look at the Occupy movement, again, organization done by new media. New media, in a sense, allows a whole lot of interest groups to have their voice heard. It seems that should actually reduce the power of the elite who may have captured old media or who may have the money power to determine the way they portrayed. Seems less likely that they control everything when we have all these other sources by which people can communicate. If you think about President Obama's presidential campaign, again, that was a campaign that relied on bringing a lot of people in, using new media, and it's something that seems less likely to have been a pro-elite presidential campaign. The third reason to dispute this notion that somehow the elite, the capitalists, have a tremendous amount of power is to some extent capital itself is not a scarce commodity today. When you think of capitalists, you think of this guy who basically owns the factory and therefore can command the workers to do what he wants because he's this monopolist sitting in command of the factory and so on. But it's very hard to think of people like that anymore. Increasingly, businesses depend not on physical capital but on human capital. They depend on the smarts of their employees. Increasingly, you find that businesses are becoming more touchy-feely, are concerned about whether their people want to stay with them. It's the authoritarian manager is less likely to be a feature of the landscape than in the past because capital, physical capital, ownership of plant and equipment is no longer the source of power it was, increasingly human capital is becoming more important. That again sits less well with this notion that somehow the elite, the capitalist elite, have captured democracy and are running it. So what is my alternative? And I want to argue that the first point, which I've already hinted at, that the crisis was not caused by elitist or corporatist policies, at least not in the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American economies. But the elite is in disrepute. Why does the Occupy Wall Street movement hate the financial sector? Because these are the guys who contributed to the policies that got us into trouble, and they've escaped scot-free. They got bailed out, now they are earning their huge bonuses, which presumably some of you are going to earn in the near future. I understand finance is still a hot profession amongst you undergrads. But they've gone scot-free while we on Main Street are still suffering the consequences. I still have to pay my student loans. Why am I not getting a student loan bailout? That's the Occupy Wall Street version. But I think in order to make the changes that the very real changes that we need to make, we need to understand first why the policies that got us into trouble emerged, and I think they emerged as much from the democratic instinct, in fact more from democracy and the way it functions, than necessarily because the elite drove those policies. But we also need to figure out how to rectify things, that given where we are, how do we make things better? How do we make more people have a sense that they have a stake in the future rather than give up on the future, as we see so many people, certainly the guys on the Occupy Wall Street front doing. So what do I want to say in this talk? This is a very quick outline of what I'm going to argue. These problems that we have in industrial countries, whether in Europe or the United States, have been a long time building. And to some extent, they're composed of two sort of sides to the problem. One was that there was enormous growth in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and I'll talk about where that came from, but which then started falling off in the 70s, okay? So that was one problem, growth fell off. And we then started having to scramble to revive that growth, and I'll talk about the consequences of that kind of scrambling. But at the same time, as the growth was high, we made promises. We made promises to previous generations, your father's generation or your mother's generation, promises in the 1960s of an expanded welfare system, of an expanded social security system, that were tenable if that growth stayed the way it was, but became less tenable as that growth slowed down, right? And what we saw in the 80s and 90s were different reactions to that fall off in growth. What we saw in a number of what I call the Anglo-American economies, whether it's Australia, the US, the United Kingdom, was a spate of deregulation as there were attempts to revive the growth. And that had some success. But that deregulation created its own problems. It created more inequality. And I will argue that had its consequences down the line. The inequality eventually led to the easy credit that created problems in this country. But not deregulating itself was also a problem. And this is what more countries in Europe faced. That a number of countries in Europe did not deregulate to the extent that the United States or the UK did, and saw growth faltering in the period in the 1990s. And as they had rising unemployment, they tried to find ways of reviving growth. One way they thought they would revive growth is by a common market, by expanding the integration of Europe. And what they did in integrating Europe, they did a half-baked job. And that created the kinds of structures that led to the problems that we see in Greece, we see in Spain, and so on, and led to a crisis. In other words, one side deregulated and saw the problems with deregulation. The other side didn't deregulate and they saw the problems of not deregulating. And so we have two sets of problems now. And we're trying to deal with these two sets of problems today. I think there are solutions. On one side, the side that deregulated, it is to give more people a chance to take advantage of the opportunities that are created by deregulation. I don't think the answer to re-regulate back, it is to give people more capabilities to take advantage of the competitive environment that we have. And for the guys who didn't deregulate, I think the answer is not more government spending, which is the answer that the Keynesians seem to push very strongly. They have reached the limits of what they can do there, and there's very great resistance to them issuing further debt. Their answers has to be more reform, more competition, more deregulation, giving more people, especially the young, a chance in those economies. Okay, so different approaches, and I think there are those possibilities. Of course, they come up against the difficulty of political change in a time of crisis, and I'll talk about that. So that's where I want to grow. I want to go. But let me start by outlining the basic premise of my argument. If you look at this, from a macroeconomic perspective, there was extremely strong growth post-World War II, especially in Europe. Now, why was there strong growth in Europe? For a number of reasons. Europe was destroyed by the war, right? Berlin was in rubble, London was in rubble. You had to rebuild. Post-war reconstruction was a source of growth in the same way as the Japanese tsunami created the rubble, which is now a source of Japanese growth over the next few quarters. Second, during the Great Depression, trade had fallen off. Trade fell in the US, bills like the Smoot-Hawley bill killed trade, but across the world, trade fell off. And post-World War, as we started creating the environment for more trade, that created more growth. So reconstruction, trade, and the spread of new technologies. This is something people underestimate. We think we live in the age of technological innovation, and to some extent we do. But think of our grandfathers or our great-grandfathers. In their lifetime, they moved from riding on horses to riding in motor cars or airplanes. Think of that kind of leap, right? What we've done is we've moved from landlines to cell phones. That's not as much of a technological leap as moving from, riding on a horse to traveling in airplanes. Massive technological change in the beginning of the 20th century that had spread a little bit. Cars had started making their way through the country in the 1930s. Telecommunications has started making its way through the country. But it hadn't fully spread out. And post-World War II, electrification, telecommunications, the automobile spread their way through the country in the United States, in Europe, and that was another important reason for the strong growth. And finally, the fourth factor was an increase in education. Widespread increase in education, more skilled people working, again, a source of growth. So put all these together, and you had the kinds of numbers post-World War II, 4.77% annual growth. This looks like emerging market growth today. That was the kind of growth that Europe had post-World War II. The US, not to sneeze at, but somewhat lower. Again, the US didn't benefit as much because it wasn't destroyed as badly by World War II, and it was actually had significantly higher levels of per capita income than Europe. What happened post 1973? So this was a time of strong growth. Lots of there wasn't enormous amounts of competition at this time. Post-depression, many countries enacted policies that reduced the level of competition in those countries. There were pacts between labor and industry to keep things nice and cozy. Things were regulated. Regulations typically favor the incumbents. There are fewer entrants. It was true of banking. It was true of transport. It was true of various industries. Lots of profits to be made if you got the growth. And the growth came, so there was plenty of profits. Those profits were shared. When you hear people talking about the good old times, when there's plenty of money to be made, we had nice, safe, secure jobs, this is the time they're speaking of. And they were nice, safe, secure jobs because there was plenty of profits to share. Now, who was being hurt by this? Somebody has to pay for it. It was not the producer, it was not the worker, it was the consumer. This was a very much producer-driven structure where consumers had more limited choice, were paying higher prices. Remember, none of you are going to remember. Remember when the airline industry was not deregulated? Yes, we had good seats. Yes, we got good food. But yes, we paid a terribly high price to travel in those planes. And deregulation brought the cheap seat. Of course, lousy food, but who cares about the food in the airline? You eat before you get up onto the plane. Also, when there was all this money to be made, you had the expansion of the welfare state. Remember the Great Society in the United States, but across Europe. People's thinking that the growth was inevitable, the growth would last forever, made enormous promises. Governments made these promises. We're going to promise our elderly, we're going to promise our unemployed, we're going to take care of you. Okay? So all this was great, except it came to an end. This strong growth fell off tremendously over the next 20 years. I mean, it fell off more abruptly than those numbers suggest, because you had the oil shock in 1973. The oil producing countries realized that they were selling oil for a song, and also were very upset post the Arab-Israeli war in 73. They jacked up the price of oil. Overnight, growth came to a halt. And interestingly, the old Keynesian measures, let's pump up government spending, let's cut interest rates, didn't seem to work anymore. Instead, you got that term, which was coined at that time, stagflation. Stagnation in addition to inflation. Okay? So growth slowed tremendously, and the world started thinking, well, what's going on? What can we do about it? So in the United States, it was in a sense the first to get really upset about this, and people just couldn't tolerate the level of inflation. If you remember, towards the end of the Carter era, there was something called the misery index, which was coined. What's the misery index?
Oh, it's the sum of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate.
Right, and it was thought that was at an all-time high, and that would be true of something like stagflation, right? You've got stagnation in growth, so high unemployment, and inflation, and add them up, it's terrible. So what started with Jimmy Carter? Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker to the Fed. People forget that. People also forget that Jimmy Carter started the deregulation of the airline industry. It started with the Democrats. This was not Reagan who started the deregulation. Jimmy Carter started this, but it was built out of frustration that the old policies were not working. Growth had slowed down tremendously. We need to revive growth, and the answer was deregulation. Let's give people a greater incentive to compete. That deregulation is going to create the potential for growth. Okay? So that was the US. This was what was then called supply-side economics. I think all too often sort of associated with the Laffer curve and reduced tax rates, and people will have more of an incentive to work. That was only part of it. It was also about liberating industry from the shackles of regulation, creating more competition, creating more entry. So that was deregulation. Took place in the United Kingdom also, what was called Thatcherism. The UK was, if anything, in a worse situation than the United States when it started in the late 70s. The coal miners' strike was sort of classic example. And Thatcher essentially broke the power of the unions, but also deregulated the economy. And By contrast, continental Europe, the reforms were slower. Not that they didn't take place. France, Germany, they did reform, but their preference was, let's reform by creating a bigger domestic market. Let's integrate the market. The European Common Market project was a way of avoiding some of the pain while getting still growth by integration. Let's get integration without going down that brutal Anglo-Saxon way of increasing competition. So what does deregulation do? It increases competition. It increases returns to the innovators, the skilled, and the creative. And that's just basic economic theory. The smarter guys are going to be in more demand. They're going to have more opportunities if there's more openings, if the incumbents don't sort of occupy and monopolize production. And so it does increase returns to the innovators, the skilled, and the creative. And you also had at this time financial sector deregulation, right? Before this, we were talking in the afternoon, banks were heavily regulated in the United States. They couldn't branch across states. They could only open branches within a state. And some states, you couldn't even open multiple branches. You had unit banking laws, right? You were regulated on how much you could pay your depositors. You couldn't pay your depositors interest, so you gave them toasters. Those were the days which went away with the deregulation, and the financial sector became much more vibrant, right? And attracted many more highly talented people like you, moving to the financial sector. In fact, there's a well, let me just show you a picture of the financial sector in the United States. This is a picture by an academic called Thomas Philippon from New York University, who plots the red line is the relative wages in the financial sector. How much people in finance earn relative to other people with similar to people in other sectors of the economy. And the green line is the relative education, the number of years of schooling in the financial sector relative to the rest of the economy. And this is a very striking picture because it says in the previous period of very high economic activity before the Depression, the financial sector was earning a lot, but it was also much more educated. It was attracting relatively more educated people into the financial sector. Then you had the period of regulation in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that closed down the relative earning power of the financial sector, but also attracted a lot more bozos into the financial sector, right? And then you start deregulating again in the 80s and see what happened, okay? Again, you saw the PhDs, the smartest guys in class going into the financial sector and earning much more than the rest of the economy. In other words, the financial sector and its deregulation is a microcosm of what was happening in the economy more broadly. The returns to talent. The smarter people were getting more simply because deregulation creates more opportunities, more returns to those people. Was this all because they were more competent? Not necessarily. I'm not saying there were no quote-unquote rents in the financial sector. But it's hard to argue from this that there wasn't also returns to talent for people in the financial sector. In fact, there's a very nice column by Calvin Trillin, who's a little bit of on the lighter side. His explanation for the financial sector was the following. He said, look, in my time, it was the C graders in class who went to the financial sector, right? These were the guys who basically couldn't add, subtract, or multiply, but they knew how to shake hands. And they were the guys who went to the financial sector because their contacts, their relationships were what were most important. But then they went to the top at the time the financial sector got deregulated, and all the smart PhDs came in at that point, and these guys who couldn't add and subtract were supervising the PhDs, right? And that created the mismatch in the financial sector. Those guys went out and created these mortgage-backed securities. Nobody, including themselves, could understand. And of course, their bosses didn't have the foggiest idea what they were doing, and that's how the whole thing imploded. So it's the C graders who are responsible for this. Now, that's an interesting idea. I don't think it's quite right, because the bosses at the time it imploded were the guys who came in here, the guys who had been in the beginning of the wave of the MBAs and the PhDs going into finance. So I don't think you can lay the blame on the guys who came in the 70s, but nevertheless, that's worth thinking about. So on the one hand, the deregulation exacerbates the returns to talent, okay? But it also does something else. Because when you overlay on the deregulation two very important forces, what are those forces? Globalization and technology. You get something more pernicious if you don't fix it. And what is that? Well, think about jobs, okay? I want you to think about jobs in two dimensions. One, the routine or non-routine jobs, okay? So routine jobs are jobs like a clerk adding and subtracting two sides of a balance sheet, or a legal worker going out and finding out through the thousands of cases that have taken place before any reference to the particular issue that you're interested in. So you're a lawyer, go send out these guys to trawl through thousands, hundreds and thousands of cases. That's routine. Similarly, you have textile workers who are also doing routine jobs. What's the difference between this and this? This is typically done by a skilled worker, somebody who actually knows to read, knows something about law, etc., etc. This is done by somebody who doesn't need that much of an education, okay? So you have routine, non-routine, skilled, unskilled. Now think about what's happening to these jobs. These guys, the guys who did textile jobs, the guys who did assembly in the United States, they don't have a job anymore. Their jobs went to first to Japan, then to Korea, then to China, now going to Vietnam, right? It's gone. What about the routine skilled jobs? Well, increasingly technology is displacing them, and where technology can't displace them, technology plus a smart guy in India is displacing them, right? I mean, think about legal discovery. Seems like you need some knowledge of law, but you need to be a guy trained at Harvard Law School to do it? No, you can be a guy trained at a no-name college in India with the help of the web, who can ask, through these many thousands of pages of documents, he can trawl through them, get a search done by his computer, and then trawl through the remaining documents to see anything that's of interest to you. So technology plus low-cost human capital elsewhere can take care of these jobs. What's left? What's left are jobs done by people who require skills. Okay? So these are the jobs that you guys are thinking about doing: the lawyer, the doctor, the engineer, creativity, human relationships, higher order thinking. These are the jobs that require that kind of skill. Okay? These are the guys who are in the 1%. If you look at the 1%, this was a question I asked the class I talked to earlier today. Which is the section which is the career that's most represented in the 1%? Anybody? Doctors, right? You guys already heard the answer. Doctors. It's not the financiers. It's not the guys on Wall Street. It's doctors. Approximately 13%. So the returns to skills are increasing, and that's showing up here. And I think doctors is important because doctors aren't the guys who manipulated the system. They aren't the guys who benefiting from the bailouts. They aren't the guys who've got weak corporate governance. They're the guys who have the skills. That's the 1%. What's for the rest? Well, you still can't automate gardening, right? You still can't automate house cleaning. Yes, you've got the Roomba, which can go around and round, but it can't completely displace the house worker, right? You can't displace the hamburger flipper still, yet. Maybe sometime. So you've got a bifurcation of jobs. The jobs that require skills, the jobs that don't require skills. The difference is these are non-routine. The routine jobs are all gone. So what you get with this is the hollowing out of the middle class, right? The hauling out of the middle class, because the jobs the middle class used to enjoy and do and get well paid for it, either here or here, have gone. And that leaves these kinds of jobs, right? So on top of the deregulation comes these forces, which are in a sense exacerbated by the deregulation because foreign competition is more able to intervene. You've got more technological innovation in a deregulated environment. And as a result, you've got greater inequality. It's not inevitable. But the way you deal with it is by moving these guys up, by giving them better skills, by giving them better education, better training. And that's where the Anglo-American economies don't do that well. They create the opportunities, but they don't create the capabilities to take advantage of those opportunities, right? So as these professors at Harvard, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz say, in the race between technology and education, education is falling behind, okay? 35% of 25 to 54-year-olds with no high school diploma have no job in the United States. Those aged 25 to 34 are less likely to have a degree today, even though degrees are more important, than those 45 to 54, okay? There's a severe skill mismatch. We've got too few people in science, technology, engineering, math, and more people in the social sciences than jobs. Now, what's going on? Well, what's going on is probably some level of inadequacy in families, communities, preschool preparation, and K-12 school experience, right? My colleague at the University of Chicago, Jim Heckman, would swear that really can't do much about somebody's education beyond age 5. They're irredeemably damaged by age 5, by the experience they've had. Now, you don't need to go that far, but basically there's a lot outside school which you can't actually fix. Even if you could fix the schools, of course, the schools themselves are harder to fix. And the problem is, as you get into these things, the dispersion increases. If you've got two parents who are professionals, who are well educated, chances are you're more likely to be well educated, to have the kinds of support for homework, et cetera, which make you essentially do well in class. So the children of the rich are much more likely to complete college today than 20 years ago. The children of the poor have actually regressed in that capability of completing college today. So things are getting worse. And there are two or three bright spots nevertheless. One, the gender imbalance in education has reversed in many ways. So today women are going much further in getting education. Of course, this creates its own pressures because the tradition has been for the male to be the dominant breadwinner in families. Now it's much more likely in many families to be reversed, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It needs to be adapted to. Second good thing is that increasingly, people who have had the education, who have had this thing, come up from a wider variety of backgrounds. If you look at CEOs in 2001, they're much less likely to be from an Ivy League school than CEOs in 1980. So deregulation, competition has increased the need for talents, increased the need for skills, but asks fewer questions about where you came from, what the color of your skin is, what your gender is, what Ivy League background you have. It's your competence which matters. That's, again, in my view, a good thing. So there are some good things from the deregulation and so on. Communities that were more oppressed before, if they have access to education, can actually come up. But of course, the problem is many of them don't have access to that education, and so in some ways, they could be falling behind. So this entrenchment is something you have to worry about because that can only get worse. And this is where I depart from the Wall Street guy, the Occupy Wall Street guys, to say, let's focus on this problem. This problem is different from the top 1% making a lot of money because capital gains are taxed at a low rate or carried interest is taxed at a low rate. By all means, fix that problem. but you still wouldn't have fixed the fundamental problem which goes beyond the top 1%. And this is what I like to show people. This is from Katz, Golden and Katz. The dark line is the 90th percentile of the wage distribution. This is not the fat cats on Wall Street. This is your office manager in a Walmart. This is your store manager in a Walmart. His income is growing relative to the income of the 50th percentile of the population. 50th percentile is probably your factory worker or your household worker. The incomes of the office manager is growing relative to the factory worker, and the big difference is the office worker has an education which extends to a university degree, the factory worker doesn't. And that's making a lot of difference. On the other hand, if you look at the 50-10 differential, the factory worker relative to the farm worker, that hasn't moved much at all. In other words, the inequality we should be worried about, many of you should be worried about, is the inequality not between you and the guys who are making tons of money on Wall Street, which presumably at some point, as I said before, you will be, but it's between you and the guys below you, which is what the Occupy movement doesn't actually look at. I mean, we are the 99th percentile. We are the 99%. It sounds less effective if you say, we are the 90th percent. In fact, it may not even be true. Many of those people protesting there had a university education. It's just they want somebody to pay the bills for them. But there are people behind them who haven't benefited as much. And those people are falling even further behind that we don't pay enough attention to. It's this difference, 90-50, I think we should be paying a lot more attention to, because that could be, we were having a little bit of a chat about this, could be the source of revolution, not just protests. Okay, so how does society react to these growing inequality? Because this inequality has been growing for the last 20, 25 years. Okay? Again, centrally, I'm not focused on the 1 versus the 99. I'm focused on the 90 versus the 50. And I would argue that as the lower middle class falls behind, as they fall into jobs which are really not very remunerative, there's tremendous pressure to do something about it. Now, I would argue that because education is difficult to tackle, and because we're working our way through the Reagan and Clinton era when there's very little appetite for redistribution, the easy answer becomes credit. Let them eat credit, seems to be the message. If we can't give them jobs, what do people care about? They care about consumption. If they can get credit in a way that they ignore the fact that they're going further and further into debt, maybe they won't worry so much about their jobs. Okay? And what's an easy way to give credit where people don't think they're going into debt? Give credit against a house. If you buy a house, the house price increases, you can borrow against the home equity. It's just borrowing against the equity. It's your money. You're not going more into debt. Of course, you're not going more into debt so long as the house price keeps rising. The moment it starts falling, you see the size of the debt that you've taken up, right? So I would argue that even if people didn't have income growth, you could give them consumption growth through credit growth. And home ownership was the best way to do it. And so there was bipartisan support from the Democrats. The Clinton administration called it the Affordable Housing Society, the Affordable Housing Mandate. In the Bush administration, it was called the Ownership Society. You can go into the details of what each one thought. But across the board, there was a push towards giving the lower middle class more access to credit, and that was a way of alleviating the concerns raised by stagnant income. And there's now some evidence which suggests that in fact the voting in Congress was consistent with this kind of push. So what is this show? What I show here is the income gap, that is the 90-10 income gap that's growing quite strongly. But if you look at the consumption gap, the 90-10 consumption gap, how much the guys at the 90th percentile are consuming relative to the 10th percentile, that's not growing so much. What's making up the difference? Credit. In fact, colleagues of mine, Marianne Bertrand and Adair Morse, show that in the counties where there was more income going to the upper segments of the population and there was more unequal income distribution, there's far more pressure on the lower income people to go out and consume. And they did. But how do they consume? Through debt. And those are also the communities where you have more distress now, because they consume their way into distress. So the bottom line question is, was deregulation a failure? And the answer is no. I think it worked in some ways. Think of all the goods you have access to, the low prices you have access to, the low inflation. All that is, I think, a consequence of deregulation. But it especially helped lower income households. I mean, Walmart, this macroeconomist now calls something the Walmart effect. The fact that lower middle class households have access to the kinds of goods you have in Walmart, much cheaper prices than they would have had access to goods earlier. And that itself increases the real value of the incomes. Even if their incomes are stagnating, the fact that goods have become cheaper, especially goods they buy, compared to the goods that the rich buy, has been a benefit for them, right? Now, it would also have helped them as producers if skills had improved. If the skills of workers had improved, it would have helped them, but it didn't. Financial deregulation helped initially. We got interest rather than toasters. The stock market went up for quite some time. But what we didn't do was control the excesses of the financial sector. In fact, we encouraged it to excess through policies. And I would argue the policies, in part, was driven by making people feel better off. So ultimately, my argument of what happened in the United States was not a failure of capitalism, not a failure of free enterprise, but it was a failure of financial capitalism in an environment where democratic pressures to unleash credit were tremendous. And that's why I keep saying we have to look around instead of pointing the finger just at Wall Street. And undoubtedly, there was a huge amount of rapacity, if not actual criminality. I don't know if we have evidence of huge amount of criminality. We have evidence of some criminality on Wall Street. But we have certainly evidence of things going crazy, of the private sector being problematic. But I would argue that in developed countries, the whole point of the regulatory system is to restrain that. And this time it didn't, and that was because everybody wanted it to go in that direction in some sense. You wanted the credit. All the politicians who run away from the subprime credit and saying this was crazy, this was those goons, before the crisis were all present cutting ribbons every time these houses were opened up as new houses for the poor, for the lower middle class. They were cutting all those ribbons when those houses were constructed in their neighborhood and saying now these guys have easy access to credit, right? So I think we need to think about how we tame finance in an environment where there's so much political pressure in good times to unleash it, to not put any constraints, whether it be from the Fed, whether it be from Congress. Let me turn quickly to the euro area. These were the guys who didn't deregulate, right, or deregulated to a lesser extent. And the classic example of the lack of deregulation was Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal. Very slow growth before they acceded to the euro area, very high levels of unemployment, okay? And just to give you some numbers, Greece, 1999, 12% unemployment. Italy, 11%. Spain, 15.6%. This was 1999. What happened then is they got into the euro area. And they became subject to common monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. And now they had a boom. Why? Simple reason that once they got into the euro area, two things happened. One, they had access to cheap government financing. And two, because the European Central Bank kept interest rates low, they had access to cheap private financing at low, sometimes negative real interest rates. So housing took off. That's the low negative real interest rates. And local government spending took off in Spain, federal government spending in Greece because of the easy access to finance, right? So lots of spending, and unemployment goes down. Look at these levels of unemployment before the crisis. It goes down across the board in these countries. But of course, they haven't fixed the fundamental problem, which is they are uncompetitive. The reason they had high levels of unemployment before was because they were not competitive. Now, as they spend more, they become even more uncompetitive. Greece, if the government is hiring at high wages, the private sector has to match it by paying higher wages. If any one of you has visited Greece before the crisis or in 2009, 2010, you would have found prices extremely high. Why? Because the economy is uncompetitive. Because the wages have grown up to a level which you can't afford to pay as a tourist. So competitiveness in these countries falls. They don't produce anything, this is an overstatement, but they produce few things that outsiders want to buy. In the meantime, however, some other economies in Europe have become more competitive, and I'll talk about that a little later. So what happens? The crisis hits, you can't spend any more, you can't find ways to postpone the inevitable, and unemployment goes back up. In Spain, goes up to 22%. In Greece, these numbers are dated, it should be more like 18%. In Italy, it's more like 10%. You're back to the future, where you started out from, which suggests the euro area sort of experiment was just an interlude, which postponed the inevitable. You're back to where you were, which is your lack of competitiveness. So, in sum, have the capitalists subverted democracy? I would say no. It was populist policies. Policies to keep growth going when segments of the population were falling behind, which produced unsustainable solutions. In the US, easy credit. In Greece, government spending. Okay? Now, this is not to hold the private financiers blameless. This is not to say that they were unwilling tools, but to argue that there was a convergence between business and politics. Don't tax us, but spend. Spending is good. Spend more, buy more. It's good for all of us. We will grow without thinking about who will pay the inevitable bill. And the bill has come due now. And so to argue that that policy before the crisis was elitist is, I think, a misreading of what happened. What was, to some extent, elitist is that we focused on this. We focused on populist answers rather than on bettering the fundamental condition of the people falling behind. But you couldn't better that fundamental condition in the short run. There were no short-run answers. And democracy responds, as it often will, with short-run unsustainable answers. What about post-crash? Did the post-crash policies favor the elite? Was that a subversion of democracy? And I think to some extent it was. I think the bailouts to the banking sector could have been handled in a more political fashion. The bankers should have paid more in terms of the shareholders should have paid more. There should have been dividend restrictions. The bankers should have been told that some of the help is in return for you not shrinking your assets tremendously and cutting back on credit. There should have been a moratorium on bonuses and so on. I mean, all those things we can talk about now should have been done then. And some of us, including me, were saying they should have been done then. We were talking about things like dividend restrictions, railing against banker bonuses in times of downturn at that time. But was it that somehow Ben Bernanke was captured by Wall Street, Henry Paulson was captured by Wall Street? After all, Hank Paulson came from Goldman Sachs. I think that's a harder argument to make. In many ways, the Obama administration followed exactly the policies the Bush administration followed. I would argue it's not as much crony capitalism that was at work as cognitive capture. If you talk to Hank Paulson, the overwhelming sense is here's a man of integrity, but a man who doesn't understand that he could well have been captured. That if you read his book, for example, you will see again and again he calls around on Wall Street to understand what Wall Street thinks about the crisis. Very few discussions about calling outside Wall Street, of trying to get the opinion of more common people about what should be done. And so it is natural that the solutions that come out, especially for a man who's trained on Wall Street, are pro-Wall Street. But he feels he's saving the United States. He's not doing it for petty gain. In fact, he didn't have any reason to bail out Goldman Sachs for petty gain. He already had his money out in a blind trust, right? So in that sense, I don't think it's the crude form of corruption. It's not, I'm saving my friend because my money is at stake. It's more, I can't think differently because I've talked to these guys all my life. And these are the guys I'm going to talk to again when they're in trouble. They're the guys who are going to inform me. And similarly, the Fed, very close with the people they regulate. This is regulatory capture, something we've talked about again and again. It's not these guys are criminally minded. It's not that these guys are corrupt. It's that they are tempted to see problems from the lens of the people that they regulate. And that's the kind of, that's how, in a sense, the policies get biased. But in general, the reason a number of countries are in trouble, the reason the US has a huge fiscal problem is not because of the bank bailouts. In fact, if you look on net, the bank bailouts are really very small in the United States. The bigger problems are because we have large deficits for the usual reasons. We have low revenues in a crisis. We have lots of unemployment, especially in the States. We have stimulus spending. But in the United States, the bigger problem is that earlier problem I pointed to. The promises we made in the 60s, Social Security, healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, are unaffordable in an environment where growth has slowed. So either we got to up growth or we got to reduce promises. And that's true in spades in Europe also. I'm going to sort of move quickly over this. There is a lot of sense that corporations have captured policymaking, especially with these PACs and so on. And clearly there is an effect of money there, okay? But the fact that corporations are spending a ton of money doesn't necessarily mean they have captured policy, because there is competition amongst corporations. One corporation wants A and another corporation wants not A. And they both can spend money to keep the politician honest, relatively, right? So it's not necessary that more spending corrupts policies in a particular direction. But even if it did, I think there is, even if competition for influence doesn't work, there's also a countervailing force, which is that the costs for the public organizing and disseminating information have fallen. The costs of locating malfeasance, publicizing it, have fallen. The number of emails that are now publicized very quickly, what was happening behind closed doors, what conversations were taking place, all that has increased. So it's not a priori obvious just because more money is being spent in the political process that necessarily the corporate interests have got stronger. I'm not saying they haven't. I'm just saying it's not necessary that that be the case. We need to work through this and see on net, are we getting worse policy making, and just looking at the dollar amounts that are going to this process, not clear. And there are countervailing forces to some extent that prevent this from, take people with different corporate interests. Enron. Enron was the epitome of corruption as a corporation. But who blew the whistle on Enron? It was this hedge fund manager who basically didn't believe any of the numbers. And he had a big incentive because he had shorted Enron. He had a big incentive to blow the whistle on Enron, and he blew the whistle, and that's when people started investigating more in that. And that's the sense in which corporate interests are not necessarily aligned. For every corporation which wants things to go one way, there's another corporation which may want it to go the other way. So just the fact that the corporations are more powerful, more rich, etc., doesn't necessarily mean that they've captured policy making. Finally, has the power of capital over labor increased? And this is the point I was trying to make earlier. In the early part of the 20th century, you could argue that monopoly capital was very, very powerful. The guy who owned the factory, if you didn't have an alternative job, this was the only factory in town, where would you go to work? So the guy had tremendous power over you. This was the capitalist with a big C, very powerful That's why unions organize to combat the relative power of the capitalists. But with lower entry barriers, deregulation, easier access to finance, that kind of power has diminished, right? There are alternatives. There are different factories in town. There are different employees in town. And now it's not your plant and machinery which gives you sort of power, which gives you capabilities. It's your intellectual capital. It's Apple with its design, with its creativity. It's Google. But in that environment, intellectual capital is not the same as physical capital. It can be eroded quickly. If you don't innovate, if you're not on the cusp of innovation, you're going to fall behind. And in order to get innovation to happen, you need more satisfied workers. You need more empowered workers. And that itself is eroding the power of physical capital. Human capital has greater power of its own. And so when people point to the diminishing role of the unions, often they have in view the diminishing role of the unions is because they were hammered by the Republican governments, and that's what killed the unions. I think that's a possibility, but the alternative possibility is workers themselves didn't need the unions. Because what the unions tended to do was try and apply a uniformity across workers, negotiate for equal pay, equal status for the large part. And what workers themselves realized is there's a lot of differentiation amongst us. And we can get greater pay on our own, at least the better ones thought that they could, because they had greater human capital. And so there was, within corporations themselves, a resistance to egalitarian solutions, which is why, with things like card check, you're trying to force the unionization on companies when the workers themselves, if left on their own, don't necessarily want to opt for unions, okay? We're in a world where the workers themselves, because of their human capital, have more power. Not true of all industries. Not true of hotel workers, unskilled, low human capital workers. They still need the kind of organization that workers of the past needed. But do consultants need organization? They don't have unions. Do highly skilled factory workers need organization? They don't, because their human capital itself is enough to get them power. And finally, in this world where we have this differentiation, again, let me come back to this working rich rather than the idle rich in a second. So the real problem, I think, in the United States today, in fixing some of the things I've talked about, is how do you deal with the unskilled? Because they're at the bottom of the totem pole. How do we deal with the gardeners, the restaurant workers, the home aides for the elderly? They use undifferentiated low-skilled commodity labor, and their wages are being held down by competitive markets, by automation, by trade. Not necessarily by the capitalist, but because it's really very hard for them to up their wage. Instead, it seems to me what we're seeing is an attempt to organize across industries so that the category of labor itself gets some bargaining power. If, for example, if you enact a minimum wage, you have to pay that minimum wage across all segments. And so you don't need unions here, but you need legislation across this thing to elevate. So we're seeing that kind of thing happening. All this living wage debate and so on is an attempt to get these undifferentiated workers with low skills at least up to a level on the totem pole where they can get a reasonable wage. It's not because of the power of capital, in my view. It's because the skills, their ability to command, in a sense, any higher wage is very limited. It's because there's tremendous amounts of competition for that kind of labor. It's not because they're being held down by the capitalists. So, what are the policies that will pay in the long run? It's a combination. For example, in the United States, more skills, more education, more innovation. But how do you do it? I mean, we've already said education is just very, very difficult to tackle. And of course, in the short run, there are tremendous problems which need tackling today. how do you get the unemployed, especially the low-skilled young workers, the low-skilled young in the United States into jobs, but also in Spain and in Greece? What do you do with a 55-year-old GM worker? The 55-year-old GM worker who's too young to retire, but feels he is too old to learn a new skill. Now, the hottest industry, the hottest career in terms of growth is nursing. We do see a lot of auto workers moving into nursing, but it's not clear that GM worker wants to go into nursing. What do you do with those people? Somebody is genuinely unemployed. You don't admit to that possibility, but what if somebody is a reasonable wage? Those are the questions we need to address, even while we're tackling the bigger questions of how to re-engage innovation and get skills going. And finally, I think we still haven't answered the question, how do we get finance capitalism to work well? How do we get finance from going overboard? We've already seen at least 3 crises in the last 3 decades, right? 3 or 4 in industrial countries. You saw the S&L crisis in the 80s. Saw the emerging market lending crisis in the 90s. You saw the dot-com boom in the early 2000s, and we've seen the 2007-2008 Great Recession. Is finance overly exuberant? But we can't shut down finance because the brains of a modern society are in the financial sector. How to allocate resources, where to allocate them. That's what the financial sector is supposed to do, where to allocate risks. In a modern society, you can't function without a financial sector, without a vibrant financial sector. Making finance boring, as Paul Krugman wants to do, is not possible. It's not going to keep us going. But at the same time, you can't afford to have a crisis every 10 years. Now we can't afford it, we can afford it even less because there's no government capacity to bail out the system again. So what do we do? How do we reduce the destabilizing tendencies while keeping the vibrancy? That's, to my mind, the problem of the ages. And finally, we have to do all this in an environment that's extremely difficult, right? There's tremendous distrust of the elites out there. In the US, there is the Tea Party, there's the Occupy. They both identify the same problems. It was the elites from Wall Street in bed with the guys from Washington. But of course, their solutions are radically different. The Tea Party wants less government and more sort of private enterprise. The Occupy people want less private enterprise, less financiers, more government. In the euro area, there's extreme degree of skepticism for any central solution. People, basically see the euro area as something as having created more problems than benefits. The Germans don't like the Greeks don't like the Germans, but they both sort of locked together in this area where they're at the same time, the elite in the euro area spend a lot of time in each other's capitals. They're sort of together every second week. And so they love each other, they like each other's cultures, they enjoy being together, but the people hate each other. How do you function in an environment where you don't have that kind of integrity? And of course, the worry in all this is all the stuff that went well post-World War II will be forgotten. You already hear sort of murmurs, I shouldn't say murmurs, you hear a lot of yelling against trade. Even President Obama started talking about insourcing versus outsourcing. That tends to get louder over time. You can see it happening in Europe. Great anxiety against the foreigner. And the worry is that this turns against trade, this turns against immigration, and we go back to the post-war consensus to focus on the household as producer without recognizing all the gains that happen when you have competition and the household is seen as a consumer. So we have a lot to think about, but I would argue, or I would submit to you, that our problems are not that the elite have captured policy making. It's a much more complex and nuanced situation. And it's a relative statement I'm making. I'm not saying the elite are powerless. I think they always had power. But I don't think they have more power now than they had in the past. I think it's quite different. And in some ways, the industrial democracies are facing up to the problems that the emerging markets and the developing countries had to face in the past. How to create growth. And the industrial countries never thought they would have to face up to this, because they thought growth is here to stay. We have the institutions, we have the finance, everything is hunky-dory. And they're now facing up to the problem that it isn't, in an environment where the political structure is such that it sort of works against them. There's much more conflict. You hear again and again about polarization in Washington. Well, that polarization is in part because of the inequalities which have developed over time, I would argue. And the politicians are divided and respond with short-term policies because the people themselves are divided and the people themselves are impatient. So don't blame just the politicians. Look around. I think the problems lie within us as much as the people that we send to Washington. And finally, I think if you look at reasons for hope, the reasons for hope lie outside the West. They lie in the tremendous growth of the emerging markets, the growth of the rest, so to speak. And so in some ways, this is the worst time for protectionism. This is not the time you want to erect barriers against the flow of goods, because going forward, those are the guys you want to sell goods to. If you erect barriers against them selling goods to you, you create the environment where they erect barriers against your selling goods to them. And if growth is going to happen in industrial economies, it's going to be less in the future from domestic consumption growth than from growth in the rest of the world. So hopefully, we will muddle through this process, keeping in mind that the policies that we need to undertake are the long-run policies which improve the capabilities of our economies, and that in the long run, we will benefit from the growth in the rest of the world, and that will elevate the growth in industrial economies. So that's what I had to say. I have spoken a lot. I thought I'd speak less, but I'm happy to take questions.